The Great Migration, although the first part of this is actually still looking at nativism, because I want you to start seeing the similarities, especially between nativism and basically what African Americans were also going through at this time period as they spread across the United States. Just a quick note though, also the Great Migration, you'll see here, it actually specifically jumps all the way to chapter 23, A Clash of Cultures. That page number only specifically goes with the custom edition of the 11th edition of the book we use for this class. So it might be a slightly different page for you. So finishing up nativism, the thing is, immigrants are having to face all of this nativist prejudice against them, unfairly so. And therefore, they're going to fight attempts to restrict immigration. In fact, we see the Japanese government very much hinted at even violent retaliation towards the United States if the United States ever tried to enact some sort of restrictive legislation against them that was similar to that of the Chinese. And we're going to get more into that later when we get to imperialism in America. But the thing is, most immigrants really believed that the more American they became, the less prejudice they would encounter. And so we see a really stressing of the importance of assimilation. And you have all kinds of groups being formed to help and stress this need for assimilation, like handbooks written on how to assimilate and everything. Quick note, when you see the word assimilation, the word assimilation doesn't mean just taking on American cultures and American beliefs. It's actually connotating the loss of one culture in favor of another. So giving you an example of what isn't assimilation, you'll notice every single email, every single thing that you receive from me during this class, I always sign off all my emails, best wishes, and then my name. The thing is, I actually got that from my time abroad in England. That is how everyone just happened to sign their emails. And I loved it, and I said, I'm going to keep doing it. That's not me assimilating in England. That was me just kind of taking on a British characteristic, so to speak. However, when you look at the difference between England and America on different things, one thing that could be considered assimilation is generally speaking, you don't see people out and about wearing tennis shoes in England. It's just not a big thing. They wear tennis shoes to go work out at a gym, and then they tend to wear other shoes for everything else. But if you look around in American culture, tennis shoes are a big part of culture, and especially for some of us more than others. I mean, I know that I always have a student once per semester that they collect tennis shoes. So if someone like that, who that's a big part of their cultural identity is to own lots of different pairs of tennis shoes, moved to England and suddenly decided to stop wearing those tennis shoes except for working out, that would be considered assimilation, because on some level they've given up a part of their identity in favor of what is the cultural norm of a different nation. So I want you to understand those differences there. So the thing is, as much as assimilation was really stressed in a lot of these immigrant communities, most immigrants during the late 19th century and early 20th century really are going to describe more of a process of adjustment between old and new ways. So it'd be things like me signing off with best wishes, not really giving up a big part of my identity. This is going to actually end up resulting in entirely new cultural forms. So an example of this at this time period was Portuguese immigrants back in Portugal generally held these festas every Sunday that would honor a patron saint. And in these festas, they would parade through the streets, and it was a really big celebration. Well, when these Portuguese immigrants came to the United States, especially in the New England region, they still had their festas and on Sunday, but they would combine these big celebrations to within the churches rather than going out and about. An example that I can use of my own personal life is obviously when I was living abroad, I couldn't necessarily celebrate the 4th of July the same way as we do here in America. So I went and threw loose leaf tea in a river instead. Ta-da! So let's do that Boston Tea Party. And hey, it's loose leaf tea, so it wasn't, there we go. Anyway, so whole new cultural forms, ways of celebrating one's own culture, but not necessarily encroaching against the culture that is already present. Now, the thing is, as much as we have this divide between native-born, lowercase n in that case, native-born Americans and immigrants, really the greatest divide in America was the racial divide between black and white. And so a lot of immigrants are really going to catch on to the racism that was prevalent in America, and they were really eager to assert their whiteness, basically try to have that bond with those native-born Americans that, oh, we're also that white, and thus be given that badge of acceptance a bit more. Whereas a lot of nativists generally put any immigrant into the so-called black category. I ask you this, it can be about this last slide or this next slide. How can you compare any of this to today? Going to keep moving forward. Feel free to pause, or if you want to come back to it, that's absolutely fine. Because this really brings us to the Great Migration when we're looking at that racial divide. So the Great Migration, I should start out, in 1900, about 90% of black people in the United States actually lived in the South. But starting as early as like the 1880s, you see African Americans moving out of the South, and specifically they at first move to like the cities of the Northeast, because basically they'd see all of the economic promise there, as well as the escape of persecution in the South that like immigrants were seeing. And so this is called the Great Migration. Eventually the Great Migration, there's other basically waves of it that move into other parts of the nation as well over time. Typically, African Americans, as they moved north and then eventually like west, would work as like common laborers or domestic servants, and a lot of times they're competing for jobs with all of these immigrants coming in, and most of the time African Americans lost in that competition. You see a lot of black women also working out of the home as they move out north and west. But generally speaking, for black men and women, they were rejected from any kind of job that might have direct contact with the public, which really gave them a distinct lack of options for employment, and thus a distinct lack of options when it came to like places to live. So really African Americans would be restricted to these like segregated urban ghettos in the north, and with the Great Migration and more African Americans moving north and west, this pattern of residential isolation, this pattern of segregation becomes a lot more pronounced. And that means that black people of all different social classes would live together in these areas. But once again, this restricts job options and thus limits income to black families, because then if they're all living in one area of a city, they can only get to so many jobs around them. Like I said before, black women were very likely to have to work. In fact, they were 5 times more likely to work than married white women because of the limited options and limited income for black families at this time. We also see popular culture, just as like we looked at before, reinforcing the marginalization of African Americans. This could be anything from like vaudeville and minstrel shows that had songs that belittled black people, to when there was a black person present in a play or a song or something like that, they'd have names like Useless Peabody. We even have seen immigrants absorbed that culture of racism from the shows as well. Films perpetuated all kinds of negative stereotypes. Now, that being said, African Americans did want to still build their own communal institutions, but you have this chronic lack of capital, basically keeping their businesses mostly small and confined within the ghetto, and basically a lot of these were more likely to fail. And so they failed at much higher rates, though some institutions over time do better, such as like you eventually get things like black branches of the YMCA and the YWCA that actually provided a home for a lot of like black migrants going into northern cities. Really quick, you'll notice that I talked about that this is like way later on, but I wanted to make note of why I talk about it now. Part of the reason I talk about this now is there's so much overlap between what African Americans faced and what immigrants faced. It's not the same thing, but there is some overlap there, and so I think it's important to note it. Also, notice the Great Migration really is starting as early as like the 1880s, but really most of the time when historians talk about the Great Migration, it's considered part of the 20s. So that's why it's in that section in your book. So just wanted to give you that heads up.